Well, good morning. This is Ian R. Crane, and it's the morning of Monday, 17th of June, 2019. And today is a day when history will be made. One way or another, history will be made at Westminster Magistrates Court today. And I hope that there will be many people who respond to the call yesterday to go along and support John Smith, who has pioneered the re-emergence of the common law courts. And it is John Smith who convened a common law court some weeks ago now to effectively annul the extradition of Lynn Tyre, who had been unlawfully ruled that she should be extradited to France by the corrupt Justice Michael Supperstone, who, in the absence of any substantial evidence, still decided that basically the judiciary would simply respond to the request by the French judiciary and extradite her and leave her to the French judiciary to decide what to do with her, despite zero evidence being presented. So the common law court was convened, and a jury of Lynn's peers not only annulled the extradition, but they also annulled the sentence of David Noakes, and also demanded that David and Lynn have their assets returned and that they be permitted to develop, produce and distribute GC-MAF, which has been proven to be an extremely effective cancer cure. And of course that is illegal to make the observation that anything can cure cancer other than chemo and radiotherapy, thanks to the 1939 Cancer Act, which was put in place to protect the radium industry. So here we are, nearly 81 years later, and basically that law is still in place, despite an attempt a few years ago by Lord Saatchi to overturn it. And in fact, he did succeed in getting some legislation on the statute books that would permit medical practitioners to use something akin to GC-MAF if they believed that this novel product would be beneficial to their patients. But this has been very quietly buried, of course, because Big Pharma certainly doesn't want novel treatments which prove to be effective and therefore undermine their outrageous revenue streams. So consequently, this is how the establishment deals with those who have the audacity to have humanity's best interests at heart. So there's still time to get along to Westminster Magistrates Courts, but please don't go to Westminster, because Westminster Magistrates Courts are in Marylebone, and the address is 181 Marylebone Road. It's London Northwest 1, NW1 5BR, and the hearing this morning will take place in Court 3. Now people say, but surely the decision was taken in the Court of Appeal. Yes, and John took the annulment to the Supreme Court, who didn't want to touch it. So he was pushed back to the Appeal Court, who didn't want to touch it. So this is a classic case of the can getting kicked downhill, because the establishment does not want the fact that for 350 years a fraud has been perpetrated against the people of this country by using the Cestui Que Vie legislation, or CEDIK as it's known colloquially within the legal profession, which effectively treats everybody as though they're dead. So consequently, when you're asked in the court to give your name and your date of birth, you're effectively handing over jurisdiction to the court, because you're effectively declaring yourself to be lost at sea. And of course, this sounds completely outrageous, and it's meant to. And even in my situation, where I used exactly that defence and presented me as the living man to the bankruptcy courts, and they had no means of dealing with it. So what did they do? They created another legal fiction in the name of Ian Crane to be able to balance their books. And they bankrupted that legal fiction, but nothing to do with me. And so consequently, the establishment gets very, very creative and also very fearful that there's an increasing number of people who are starting to comprehend the magnitude of the fraud. And the bottom line is, if you work in the legal profession, then you are guilty of perpetrating that fraud against your fellow man. In fact, you are effectively conceding your own humanity to perpetrate that fraud. So, it's now time to step up to the plate and start to acknowledge how this fraud has been perpetrated, because the legal statute courts are unlawful. And in fact, in a late 19th century version of Black's Law Dictionary, it stated categorically that the definition of legal was the undoing of God's law, i.e. the undoing of common law and replacing it by statute. So today is the day in which common law establishes its supremacy over statute. And it's going to be very interesting to see the tango that will be danced by the establishment as they attempt to dodge and obfuscate this truth. So if you're able to get along to Westminster Magistrates courts and witness history in the making, then you will see what occurs firsthand. And of course, the other decision by the Common Law Court was that the corrupt Judge Michael Supperstone should be relieved of his position on the bench and should appear before a people's court to answer for his crimes against Lintyre and against humanity on a wider basis. So this is the first step, perhaps, in changing the whole fabric of society, because humanity is waking up to the insanity which is perpetrated by sociopaths who are either power crazy or simply trying to maximize their self-gratification in the material realm. So that's what's occurring on a local basis in the UK. A very, very significant day here. And, basically John Smith will not be giving up. John Smith has not only proven himself to be extremely well researched, extremely knowledgeable in the process of common law and its relationship with statute law, but his tenacity is to be admired in the way he has picked up the gauntlet on behalf of Lintyre and David Noakes. And, there's still some mileage to be gained here. Well, elsewhere, on a global basis, of course, top of the news over the last few days has been the tanker explosions in the Arabian, or on the approaches to the Arabian Gulf or Persian Gulf, depending on which side of the Gulf you happen to reside. Well, of course, Jeremy Corbyn has been vilified in the right-wing press for having the audacity to question the Trump-Hunt statement that these explosions were caused by Iran. And Jeremy Hunt, of course, knows nothing about geopolitics, and that's the reason he's appointed to the role of Foreign Secretary, because if he knew anything about it, then he certainly wouldn't be able to perform that function, or not if he was sane, but of course he isn't. So that's pretty much a given. So who perpetrated this? Well, I will tell you who perpetrated those attacks in the Gulf. This has the fingerprints of John Bolton all over it. Now, John Bolton is a socio-psychopath who makes Henry Kissinger look like an arch-pacifist. John Bolton has been put on this earth, in his opinion, to ignite global conflict. And he's been trying to do this for some 2.5 decades. Well, in 1998, Bolton was one of a number of signatories to a letter sent to Bill Clinton, effectively demanding that Bill Clinton invade Iraq and remove Saddam Hussein from office. Well, obviously Bill Clinton chose to ignore that missive, but then John Bolton actually chaired a group of extreme right-wing neocon hawks who went by the name of PNAC, the Project for a New American Century. And of course, they published a document in September of 2000 called Rebuilding America's Defenses. And this document, which you can certainly download in PDF format. In fact, I'll try and put a link to it under the video. But as people will see, any links I post seem to remarkably disappear or only be visible to me and not to anybody else viewing the video. So if you can't see it, then look, just do a little bit of research for yourself. All you've got to enter into your search engine is PNAC, P-N-A-C, Project for a New American Century, Rebuilding America's Defences, and you will see the document. And this document openly advocates for total military and full spectrum global dominance. It makes no bones about the fact that the US, and this is bearing in mind back in 2000, was in a unique position to establish global dominion because there was no other superpower on the planet at that time. Well, of the 26 sociopaths that put their signature to that document, 13 of them were sworn straight into the George Bush government after he was appointed president. Of course, he stole the presidency from Al Gore, thanks to his brother, who was governor of Florida at the time. And so he appointed these hawks, 13 of the 26 hawks, into his government. One of whom was Dick Cheney, who was actually de facto the president in all but name, and George Bush was simply Cheney's sidekick. Well, Bolton was, of course, chairing that committee, and he was appointed by George W. Bush as Undersecretary of State for Arms Control. And in that position, he once again advocated an invasion of Iraq. And of course, he got his way in 2003. And he was the guy who also convinced Alastair Campbell, an intellectual pygmy, and Tony Blair to support this call for invasion of Iraq. And of course, Alastair Campbell is as guilty as sin of producing the dodgy dossier, which effectively led Parliament to support Tony Blair's call for joining the US to invade Iraq. And, how is it that Alastair Campbell and Tony Blair are not answering to the Hague for their war crimes? But that's just another theatre. Well, Bolton wrote in his memoir, which was titled Surrender is Not an Option, and he wrote, "State careerists are schooled in accommodation and compromise with foreigners rather than aggressive advocacy of US interests, which might conveniently disrupt the serenity of diplomatic exchanges, not to mention dinner parties and reunions." Well, John, sociopath Bolton, that's called diplomacy. But diplomacy, of course, doesn't exist in your lexicon, because the only diplomacy you understand is the diplomacy of weapons. But of course, you yourself would never have the courage to pick up arms. You are the type of sociopath who uses the sons of others to fight your perverse battles. So, here you are again, once again, trying to ignite global conflict on behalf of your beloved Israel. And, you've got Trump now repeating your pathetic banter of Iran poses a threat to the friends of America in the Middle East. Iran doesn't pose a threat, of course, but the fact is that Iran, like North Korea, like Cuba, are the last remaining countries that are outside of the control of the globalists because they do not subscribe to the fraud of fractional reserve banking. And until such time as those countries' leaders are deposed, then the sociopathic tendencies of Bolton will continue. And obviously, at some point, there'll be somebody else. So Bolton's picked up the mantle from Kissinger, and it'll be interesting to see who picks up the mantle from Bolton. But this is where humanity must retain its attachment to discretion and discernment, and not simply subscribe and regurgitate to the pathetic rantings of these sociopaths. And of course it's put out in the media by the likes of Murdoch, who of course also answers to the Zionist controllers of a certain Middle Eastern country. Well, let's see how this unfolds. Bolton must be held to account. At some point, this socio-psychopath who has a determination to unleash global conflict on this planet must answer for his crimes to a common law court of his peers. Although hopefully he doesn't have any genuine peers, because hopefully there is nobody else who is quite so insanely sociopathic as this guy, who will, of course, constantly hide behind public office. And, you know, one can only assume that he has some very damning photographs of certain individuals, because how else does a guy of this degree of insanity constantly get into high public office? Well, elsewhere in the UK, of course, we have the pantomime of the Tory party leadership. And for those of you who are not at Westminster Magistrates Court today, then I would encourage you to watch today's edition of the UK Column News at 1 o'clock, because the guys at UK Column have some remarkable revelations to share with you regarding the pantomime of the Tory leadership, and particularly the pantomime of Brexit and the pantomime of EU military unification. And let's not forget that Boris, when he was Foreign Secretary, he signed up to EU military unification, and now Jeremy Hunt, who is the current Foreign Secretary, is an advocate of EU military unification. So here we have the two front runners in the Tory election leadership who might talk a Brexit story, but in reality have no intention of implementing a full Brexit. And it is simply going to be another 6 months of media pantomime and Westminster pantomime, as the can just gets kicked further and further down the road. So obviously people are waking up to the reality. More and more people are talking about it. And, you know, it is very evident that an increasing number of people are now looking to the alternative media to get their information, which is why the likes of Facebook and YouTube are now starting to remove commentators who have the audacity to challenge the official narrative. So I am extremely grateful to those who have sought to post my video output on other platforms. So pretty much everything I've ever produced is also now on Vimeo and BitChute, and maybe other platforms soon to be announced. So, you know, we got a plan for what's coming, and that is that the establishment, in its desperation to control the narrative, removing those of us who question the motivation and question the veracity of the output of the establishment media. So thanks for joining me today. It's going to be a very, very interesting day. Obviously, depending on what transpires at Westminster today, I may well do an impromptu live stream either later this afternoon or maybe tomorrow morning. Failing that, I will definitely be back with you on Wednesday morning at 8:30. So you have a great day. And as is always the case, please don't take anything I say at face value. You've no need to do that at all. Do your own research. And, you know, if you're not familiar with the advocacy of global conflict by John Bolton, then do take a scan at the document that is now nearly 19 years old, the Project for a New American Centuries, Rebuilding America's Defenses. And you will see the magnitude of sociopathy amongst these hawks, and led and chaired by none other than John Bolton, the man whose fingerprints are all over the tankers in the Gulf. You have a great day, and I'll catch you with you later.